pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, pawn to d6, bishop to b5, knight to c6, king to g1, bishop to d7, rook to e1, knight to f6, pawn to h3, pawn to a6, bishop to f1, pawn to g5, pawn to d4, pawn to g4, pawn to d5, pawn to f3, pawn to c6, bishop to c6, queen to f3, knight to d7, knight to c3, pawn to e6, queen to g3, queen to e7, knight to d5, bishop to d5, pawn to d5, pawn to e5, pawn to b4, pawn to b4, rook to b1, pawn to a5, pawn to a3, pawn to f5, pawn to b4, pawn to a4, bishop to b5, bishop to g7, rook to a1, king to g8, rook to a4, rook to c8, rook to a7, knight to f6, pawn to c4, king to h8, queen to g5, queen to c7, queen to f5, knight to d5, queen to d7, queen to d7, bishop to d7, rook to c4, bishop to e6, rook to d4, bishop to d5, rook to d5, rook to b7, rook to d3, bishop to e3, pawn to d5, bishop to c5, rook to c8, pawn to b5, pawn to e4, pawn to b6, rook to c3, rook to g7, rook to c5, rook to d7, rook to b5, pawn to b7, rook to b8, rook to d1, rook to b7, rook to b7, rook to b7, rook to d5, king to g7, rook to e5, rook to b4, pawn to g4, king to f6, rook to h5, rook to b7, king to g2, rook to e7, king to f1, king to g6, king to e2, rook to f7, rook to e5, rook to f4, rook to e6, king to g5, rook to e5, king to g6, rook to e6, king to g5, rook to e5, king to g6,